Hello and welcome to the Sport for Business Daily. We are joined this morning by Brian MacNeice. Now, Brian has been a founding partner of Kotinos Partners, one of the organisations that would be familiar through sport in terms of having reviewed various strategic plans, looking back on the Olympics, all sorts of different things. But the key point of differentiation for the company has always been in managing high performance in organizations, whether that be in the sporting world or the business world. Now, over the past week or so, the deal has finalized so that Kotinos is going to be part of Teneo. And Brian will be working alongside Mick O'Keefe and so many other leaders within that company. You're very welcome to Sport for Business, Brian.
Thanks, Rob. It's nice to be here.
And tell us a little bit about this journey of your own. You started off in this space working with Genesis, famous for the Genesis report into the FAI, but you joined after that. But that did give rise to a lot of work that you did within Irish sport. Give us a flavour as to how you have worked within the sector over the past number of years.
Yeah, so I guess it's interesting. Sport is a big part of my life and always has been from a personal point of view. And obviously the work that I do as a consultant and advisor to senior leaders in business, there's a very easy transition into sport as well. And so when I joined and set up the Irish office for Genesis post-Saipan, it gave me an opportunity to do some work in the sports sector as well as in the business sector. Back then, and still today, about 80% plus of the work that I do is in the business sector with corporate clients. But it was a real kind of pleasure, if you like, to apply some of that professional thinking into the sports sector, particularly as the sports sector increasingly professionalized. And so I've, helped a number of national governing bodies and various different sports organizations over the years, both in Genesis, in Kotinos, and now obviously in Teneo at a strategic level.
And you're a director of Cricket Ireland, which is one of your personal passions as well. How has cricket been over the period of COVID? Obviously, we managed to get the game played against England over in Southampton, the series, and a famous win there as well. But from a personal perspective, how is that as one sport amongst a number been impacted by the year that we've had?
The impact has obviously been very severe, and that's right across the board for all sports. Obviously, the most obvious impact is the shutting down of all activity, and that causes all sorts of problems at every level of the game, both at a club level, and clubs finding it hard to cope with and deal with the issues that presents. And then as you kind of move up the chain, certainly in a cricket context, at a regional and national level as well. Cricket actually, I feel, did a great job in getting as much cricket as they did get played over the summer. There was a real danger that there would be no cricket played whatsoever. And again, both at a club, regional and national level, a portion of the season was rescued. And obviously most famously with the win in the third ODI against England, which was a real boost for everybody within the game. But, financially, it's difficult in a COVID scenario. There's significant additional costs to be able to allow cricket to be played and every other sport to be played. And the revenue streams that underpin the game and, again, other sports have disappeared in some cases. So it's a real tricky challenge to manage all of the complexities that go with COVID in a sporting context.
And your centre of excellence, I suppose, is in that field of high performance. All of us would like to think that we are performing to the best of our ability, but your job as such is to actually find a way in which we can do it better and to fulfill all of the potential that exists within us, both from a sporting and a business context. Is there a playbook that you can work off, or is it very much down to an individual organisation and the characteristics that frame that?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've done a lot of work on researching is to try and really understand the DNA of a high performance organization. And when you reference a playbook, we actually wrote a book about it. So we published a book a couple of years ago called Powerhouse, which is an exploration of some examples of high performance organizations in action. And what we were trying to do was to understand what are the characteristics of a high performing organization? How do you create it in the first place? And once you've created it, how do you sustain it? So an awful lot of the work that we do is in that space, working with leaders in business, trying to understand how do you go about putting in place the conditions for performance at an organizational level, not necessarily at a personal individual level, but at the level of the organization, the unit, if you like. And that applies equally within the business sector. So obviously the work that I'm doing within Teneo is supporting their global client base and advising the CEOs and business leaders on those elements of organizational high performance. But it equally applies within the sporting context as well. And what we found was that the principles are pretty much the same, irrespective of what type of organization you are. So when I look at the examples that we used in the book, we have a case study around Southwest Airlines in the US, around Tata in India, around the Finnish state school education system, but we also included the All Blacks in there. And again, you can see that the organizational characteristics that sustain the All Blacks are very similar to the organizational characteristics that sustain many of the other organizations that we observed and studied and researched. And again, that's the sort of stuff that we bring into the work with Teneo and advising the CEOs and leaders of our client base.
We've always drawn a fairly straight line between the lessons that you can learn from sport in the immediacy of your results coming at you straight away. You know whether you've done good or bad. It's very black and white in terms of how that divide falls. Business is softer around the edges in order to actually judge that. It can take longer for decisions to actually play out and come to fruition. But that line of lessons learned from one being transferable over to the other, is that a genuine sense?
Yes, it is. I'm always very careful to avoid what I call the halo effect, which is, we base our analysis of a situation purely on the actual result. I much prefer to look at the underlying kind of structures, systems, processes, culture that's in place within an organization, because that's the real indicator as to whether or not you're going to deliver on an ongoing basis sustainable performance. On any given day, you may perform. The line between winning and losing and the margins are always kind of, really, really tight. But if you're doing all of the right things in the right way, if you've got the right structure and plan, if you've got the right focus, if you have everybody aligned and pointing in the right direction, your operational processes are consistent with all of that, the underlying behaviors and culture that you're trying to foster, if they're all right, then inevitably you're going to win a lot more than you're going to lose. And so that's the stuff that we look at putting in place. When I look at an organization, that's what I look at. When I look at a sports organization, that's what I look at. It's no different looking at an NGB and all those components in an NGB to a corporate bank or a food processor or a pharma company. The principles, the structures, the core components are repeatable and exactly the same.
Do you think that the impact that we've all experienced through COVID, through a complete disruption of our lives, our sport, our places of work, our ability to work with colleagues, do you think is that the kind of impact which is going to change us and the way we work permanently? Or is it something that we are actually going to go back to the mean, go back to the way that we used to do things after a period of time?
I think it's really interesting. I don't think there is a permanent way of working and ever was. We've evolved and adapted all the time. And there are different things, there are different stimulus that cause that adaptation. This is obviously an extreme example of a stimulus that has forced us all to adapt and to operate in a very different way. But you can see very quickly how people have managed to cope with that and learn to be agile enough to figure out how do we operate in an environment that we're currently operating within. So, is it going to go back to what it used to be like? No, of course it's not. It's going to continually evolve and adapt in the same way that it always has. And so I think you'll find that there's a bit of work to be done to figure out what that might look like going forward. But I think fundamentally we're always on that kind of evolutionary journey, understanding how everything around us shapes us and changes us. Technology has fundamentally changed us in the last decade. And that's coming to the fore now in an environment where physically we can't be together. We've relied on technology and we fast-tracked some of the technology solutions that allow us to work productively in a remote context. So I think that kind of evolution process will continue. Part of the challenge for organizations and leaders within organizations is to figure out, okay, kind of how do we go about continuing to keep people aligned, engaged, stay, the communication processes and the operational processes that we use, how do we make sure that they work in the environment that we have to work in? But yeah, I'm not sure that we'll go back to what it always was or what it was before, but that's ever been thus, right?
Yeah, leadership and inspiring people through a screen as opposed to in person is always going to be tricky, but I guess we've been facing these changes since the advent of television, since the advent of the printing press, since the advent of language. So I guess it's just another step along the way. Before I let you go, you've done some work in the past with Sarah Keane at both Swim Ireland and at the Olympic Federation of Ireland. The Olympics is one of those moments in our collective lives that does inspire, and our athletes put a lifetime of devotion towards getting there, towards peaking at a particular moment. This year, that moment has been delayed by 12 months. Do you feel as though that's going to have a significant impact on what will happen as opposed to what might have happened were the Olympics to have gone ahead at the right time?
Yeah, it's really hard to predict exactly what that impact is going to be on a individual sport by sport level. I think there are some sports, if I take it purely from a local Irish perspective, I think there are some sports that will benefit from an extra year, in that there are athletes that are kind of earlier in their journey from an Olympic perspective, and that extra year will buy them a little bit more time, and they will end up going to Tokyo better prepared and ready, if you like, to compete as a consequence of that. And maybe there are kind of some athletes within the system where this year was the right time, and kind of an extra year may not be the best thing for them individually. But I think overall across the system, I don't think it will have that big an effect on an individual athlete by athlete level. I know the detail of all of the planning that's been going on within all of the high performance programs, and you can be pretty assured that they've figured out how to navigate the challenges associated with it. I think the biggest thing is the lack of competition, and so the sports that really figure out and the programs that really figure out how to make sure that they keep that competitive edge, because training without competition is slightly different. And so the ones that get that nailed and get that right are the ones that will probably get a performance uplift or maximize at least their potential. And that's a pretty tricky challenge, because even today we still don't know what some of the qualification processes are going to look like and the competition program is going to look like for across some of the sports. So I think that's a bit of a challenge. I think the system itself is working far better now through this cycle and hopefully into the future cycles than it ever has before. So the level of cooperation between all of the different entities, whether it's the Olympic Federation, Sport Ireland, the Sport Ireland Institute, all of the different governing bodies, the increased professionalisation of the performance directors in all of the programs, The system is completely better in all of those areas than it was before. And I think that will show in performances both in Tokyo next year and hopefully moving in then to the Paris and LA cycles after that. Because the other thing to bear in mind, the Tokyo cycle still has effectively a year to go, but the Paris cycle is already underway as well. So whilst the athletes themselves will be preparing for Tokyo, the system needs to start thinking about some of the action it needs to take in preparation for Paris and for LA beyond that as well. But I think generally the system is in a far better place than it was even 3-4 years ago. And hopefully the athletes will show that in Tokyo next year.
Well, it's good to hear positivity coming through. It's been in fairly short supply so far this year, but very pleased for you joining forces with Teneo now. A good team of people in there. We've done a lot of good work with them in the past and will do so again in the future. But for now, the very best of luck to you. They say that the art of continual improvement is to compete against your previous self. So now it will be Brian MacNeice of Teneo competing against the previous self of Brian MacNeice of Kotinos Partners. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today.
Pleasure, Rob. Thank you very much.